Okay, good afternoon, good evening, good morning, whoever you are, wherever you are. This is Dr. Patrick Lockwood coming back to you again, not live, to complete or keep working on my Family Addiction Recovery series, my 6-part series. So I've already done the first video, the What is Addiction video, right? And the second part, which I'll be doing today, is the etiology of addiction in plain English to the best of my ability. And then the third video will be boundaries and triangles and why those are important concepts for understanding and managing people with addiction and substance use disorders. The fourth video will be family roles and why those are important. The fifth video will be all about the concept of relapse, what it is, what's the difference between a slip and a relapse. And the sixth video will be all about process addictions and what we call like porn addiction and things of that nature, and how what the truth of the research is there, and the difference between compulsive behavior versus addiction when it comes to what we call process addictions. So that's the 6-part series. Today will be all about the etiology of addiction, the how. How does addiction happen? That's what today is all about. And I want you to keep in mind a popular media figure now who has been struggling with benzodiazepines, Jordan Peterson, the famous psychologist. It seems like kind of all of the sudden he was struggling with addiction, it seemed like, or substance dependence, depending upon how you look at it. And again, as I'm talking, I want you to keep in mind that I'm talking specifically about the concept of addiction, not necessarily substance use disorders in general. So again, just to go over real quick my definitions from the previous video, which I hope you go watch or listen to. There's substance use, which is typically minimal and mostly unproblematic use of substances without tolerance, withdrawal, or compulsivity. Then we have what's called substance abuse or substance misuse, which is a spectrum of problematic behavior of mild to moderate, mostly frequent substance use behavior with some consequences, but typically no tolerance or withdrawal. But there are also people at the severe end where they have very frequent substance use behavior with the beginning of tolerance and withdrawal and possibly some compulsivity, but not typically when we call it substance misuse. And then the third category of substance misuse behavior I'll call addiction, which is a pathological relationship to intoxication with tolerance, withdrawal, compulsive use, and use despite negative consequences. And hopefully in this video today, it will be perfectly clear why I use the phrase a pathological relationship to intoxication. So, first, let's talk about what this group of people looks like, right? So I'm going to post some links in the caption when this is published on YouTube, so feel free to take a look. So according to SAMHSA data, we have some pretty good, pretty reliable data about what this population of people that we call addicts looks like. So in 2017, approximately 1.4 million people received treatment for substance use disorders, typically of the moderate to severe range. And, over the course of their lifetime, approximately 49% of people have used illicit drugs in the past year. So that means that substance use behavior is not rare. That's the first thing. The second thing is people receiving treatment is extremely rare. Why it's rare, I don't know, but it seems to be extremely rare. So that's a problem that we need to address, and as I make more of a case in future videos, hopefully you can maybe see yourself, supporting more people in getting treatment for their substance use behavior and helping them with managing some of these etiological causes that I'm going to discuss here. So, just as a quick overview of the different topics I'll address here in this etiology video, the first one is genetics, and this is going to be as simple as I humanly can make it. The second topic is the neuroscience of addiction, what we know from learning models in animals and humans in addiction. And then the third topic will be learning theory, classic behaviorism and learning theory, and why that applies to addiction. And then the fourth topic will be basically social influences on addiction. And all these variables in the person that we would call an addict, all these variables are weighted differently because there's no perfect understanding we have of how one particular individual comes to struggle with the progressive brain disease of addiction, the substance use disorder that is a pathological relationship to intoxication. So we don't know. We can't possibly know. But what I can tell you is that we have a pretty decent understanding of some basic causal mechanisms, and the degree to which any particular set of these causal mechanisms is at play is going to vary pretty dramatically between groups of people and even individuals. So let's jump into genetics, and I'm going to try and do this as slowly and simply as I can, and I hope that if I lose you or if I'm saying something wrong, you let me know as soon as humanly possible in the comments or on Twitter, so that I can come back and correct things and or release a second video kind of redoing this experience. So in terms of genetics and addiction, there are kind of two categories of information that I want to deal with here. I want to deal with a concept called heritability, and then another concept called the genetic profile. So the first concept is just heritability. Heritability is just a statistic that tells scientists how much of the variance for a given phenotype, such as like a trait like height, exists in terms of genetics. So in the simplest terms, heritability is the degree to which we can reasonably say something has a genetic basis that it passes down from generation to generation. For example, heritability estimates for how tall we are ranges between 60 and 80%, according to this slightly older Scientific American article I found. And there's also a Nature article I found that kind of corroborates it, but it's a little bit older. But notice that it's a range. Between 60 to 80% of the variance in height is due to genetics. Some groups of people might have more environmental sensitivity to, let's say, nutrition, due to historical or evolutionary or cultural reasons, whereas other cultures that have been, let's say, more historically stable might have higher height heritabilities. Also, because it's not 100%, that means that some percentage of height variability is accounted for by environmental factors such as nutrition, stress, etc. So I hope that makes sense. I hope you understand what heritability means there in the most basic sense. And again, those Nature articles on height I will link in the caption for you. So, heritability estimates from solid research studies are pretty rare for addiction disorders. One of the more recent and more quality heritability studies by Ducci and Goldman, right around 2012, found that heritabilities for various substance use disorders range from 0.39 to 0.72. Which means that something like between 15% and 52% of the variance in why people develop addictions is related to genes that you inherit. So anywhere between 15% and 52%. And at the low end, and I'll post the link to this article in the caption so you can take a look. At the low end, you have hallucinogens at 0.39, so about 15% of the variance in hallucinogen misuse disorder is due to genetics, because it's not a very dopamine-heavy drug. But for the very dopamine-heavy drugs like cocaine and opiates and things of that nature, it's higher, which is interesting. So that's just a quick overview. And then a similar article that I found in the journal Nature showed something like 33 to 71% of the variation in nicotine dependence is attributed to genes, or 48 to 66% of the variance in alcohol dependence is heritable. And then other recent meta-analyses of different twin studies report heritability estimates of between 51 and 59% for cannabis use disorder, and then for cocaine use disorders, 42 to 79%, with lower estimates for females typically. And there's been some larger scale studies done with opioid addiction, with some reporting as low as 23% and others as high as 54%. So what you'll notice is that the heritability studies are all over the board. And it varies wildly from population to population. And I could sit here and I could go through study after study after study with you, but that would be pretty needless. The heritability studies are all pretty similar in the sense that drugs like nicotine, cocaine, and alcohol tend to have, on average, higher heritabilities, whereas cannabis, psychedelics like LSD, and sedatives like Xanax have lower heritabilities, and opioids kind of towards the higher end too. So what does all this mean, essentially? If it's, in the low end of 15%, the high end of 72%, what's all this mean? It means that genetics plays a significant role. Even if it's the lowest possible and where it's like 15%, that's still something, right? Something about your dopamine genes, your dopamine transporter, your OPRM1 transporter matter. So that's the first of the two categories. And then the second category is genetic profile. And genetic profile matters fairly minimally in this particular case in terms of the type of disorder it is. So there are a few dozen genes implicated in addiction from what I can tell in terms of the research I read. So a few dozen, not a few thousand, right? Just a few dozen. And I'll be linking a few studies in the caption that you can take a look at. So for instance, we know that the genes for alcohol dehydrogenase, which is responsible for metabolizing alcohol, impacts your sensitivity to alcohol addiction. And other genes like the OPRM1 gene or the serotonin transporter or the dopamine transporter, DAT, for the D2 and D1 receptors are implicated in addiction disorders like alcohol, cocaine, nicotine, and for opiate use disorders. So basically, there are some pretty solid studies that exist. There aren't many, and there need to be much, much more done, but there are some pretty solid studies that have looked at the heritability of addiction. And there's not really a solid genetic profile. So we've got good heritability, minimal on the profile side. So it's important to keep in mind that genetics is part of addiction, but genetics only loads the gun. Environment has to pull the trigger at some point. So I hope that wasn't too terrible in terms of talking about genetics. I just wanted to try and do it as simply as I humanly could. And if you want to learn more about it, please read the articles that I will link in the caption for you. So, because genetics is just one variable, that means that there's a lot that's fairly preventable that we can do that will help people maybe not develop this progressive brain disease. So now let's switch over to the neuroscience discussion. And again, I'm going to try and do this in as simple a dialogue as I can, and I'm going to try and speak a little more slowly so I don't, say anything too quickly or too in a rushed way that confuses you. Because some of this is easier for me to comprehend. I've been reading about it for decades now, but many of you probably aren't too involved in the neuroscience world. So I want you to try and understand these areas of the brain, neurotransmitters, as simply as possible, even though they're fairly complex. So we've studied what happens in both animals and humans, or primates, non-primates, etc. What happens in the brain when someone develops this progressive brain disease of addiction, substance use, substance dependence, tolerance, or withdrawal. We know what this looks like in the brain. Now, the caveat is we've done most of these human studies, fMRI, PET scan studies, with predominantly Caucasian, educated, etc. individuals. Not all of it, but a lot of it. So we have a lot of what we call weird, white, educated, etc. data, just as a caveat. But what's interesting is even though we've done it in only certain groups, a lot of the same brain areas map pretty reliably in terms of humans versus lower primates, etc., even rats. So I'm going to start off with a basic framework of how you would behaviorally and neurologically describe addiction. So we're going to use George Koob's work on the 3 stages of addiction in terms of the neuroscience. So the stages are anticipation/preoccupation, where you're kind of obsessing about using. The second stage is what we call binge or intoxication, where you're kind of actively, compulsively using the substance. And then the third stage would be what we call the withdrawal or negative affect stage. So these are the three classic neuroscience-informed conceptualizations of what addiction looks like. It's three phases of progressive behavior change related to substance use behavior. So in terms of the different brain areas, like if you go to the National Institute of Drug Abuse, you'll see a fancy but not so fancy diagram, a picture of a brain, and they basically blame general areas for dysfunction related to addiction. So they blame the prefrontal cortex as the main area. They kind of associate that as the main area where you find anticipation or preoccupation or obsessing about using. So if you're a 12-stepper, you probably hear the phrase the obsession to use. And that's what the NIDA, for instance, focuses on in terms of the prefrontal cortex. And the prefrontal cortex has basic responsibilities for integrating information, for planning, for thinking through things, for kind of managing different tasks and impulse control and things of that nature. Then you have the binge and intoxication stage. And classically speaking, this has been subsumed by what many neuroscientists have called for years the reward system. And it's not a reward system, so I'll explain that here in a little bit. But the classic brain areas responsible for the binge intoxication stage include the ventral tegmental area, the nucleus accumbens, or more broadly, the ventral striatum, and sometimes your right orbital frontal cortex is involved. And these areas are responsible for basically seeking out things and learning about activities that are rewarding. So I'll come back to that in just a second, and then I'll talk about why that's important and why we want to understand why it's not about reward. And then the final area, or the final set of areas, is related to the withdrawal negative affect stage, the third stage. And, the NIDA talks about the extended amygdala, which is really a conglomeration of multiple areas that are connected to the amygdala. So if I were to break this down a little bit more specifically, using the three-stage model, anticipation, binge, withdrawal, if you want to talk about anticipation, you're talking about the connection, the interpersonal connection areas of the brain, the right orbital frontal cortex, your ventral medial prefrontal cortex, dorsolateral, the temporal parietal junction. If you want to talk about, struggling with decision making, an area of the brain that's really important for decision making is your insular cortex, especially for modifying impulses related to disgust or punishment. And I know that's an oversimplification, so if you're a neuroscience person, please forgive me, but it's just, this is a simplistic kind of talk. When it comes to binging, we've got decreased activity in the insular cortex, and we've got increased activity in the ventral tegmental area, nucleus accumbens, periaqueductal gray, which is kind of your storehouse of your opiate receptors, your mu opiate receptors, and your hippocampus. And in the withdrawal and negative affect stage, you have your anterior cingulate lighting up, you have your amygdala, certain parts of your amygdala lighting up, and those parts of the brain are basically built to monitor threat, and they're built to monitor disconnection, and they're built to monitor kind of aversive stimuli, so negative feeling stimuli. So all these different parts of the brain have a multiplicity of purposes. None of them are just specifically designed for substance use behavior, if that makes sense. So it's not like this is the addiction part of the brain. That's nonsense. And I want to go back to specifically that binge intoxication stage, because this is kind of the money shot when it comes to the neuroscience of addiction. So what happens is, when your typical, what we call drug-naive person or drug-naive rat is exposed to a drug, this ventral tegmental area and nucleus accumbens lights up like a Christmas tree. We go, oh wow, huge dopamine rush. This is amazing. I want to do this thing again because it feels amazing, especially if you're experiencing the high and the intoxication in such a way that's positive for you with minimal consequence and things like that. So if you're drug naive, you have a giant dopamine rush. And this is why most neuroscientists have blamed dopamine as one of the main problem chemicals for addiction. Here's the problem. Over time, that dopamine response starts to attenuate and decrease. So I'll describe to you a classic behavioral neuroscience study that's done with rats that kind of explains the process of tolerance and withdrawal. And again, remember, tolerance is just needing more and more and more of the substance in order to elicit the same subjective state, emotional state, high state, intoxication state that you once had. So basically, you need more of the drug to get high in the same way. Now, there's different types of tolerance. There's behavioral tolerance, there's, metabolic tolerance, there's neurochemical tolerance, and we'll talk all about some of those. But for the purposes of this YouTube video, just know that tolerance is needing more, essentially, to get the same subjective effect. And there are different biological and psychological mechanisms that facilitate that. Some of them in the brain, some of them in how your body breaks down the drug and metabolizes it, some of them psychological in terms of memory and motivation. So in this classic rat study, you take a rat, a drug-naive rat, a rat that's never gone to a bar, never had a problem with drugs, and you put them in this classic, simple, open box, right? And there's 2 water bottles. And in these 2 water bottles, when the one on the left, let's say, has regular water in it, and the one on the right, let's say, has some cocaine or some heroin in it. It's got some drugs, and there's like a marking on the box that kind of signifies that this is the drug side. So, naturally speaking, rats are curious, and this rat will go out there and start exploring, and he'll drink from the water bottle, and he'll drink from the drug water bottle. And, pretty reliably, rats will what we call self-administer drugs or drink or whatever until they die, believe it or not, which is sad, but it's how we work, especially if we can keep using. So what happens is you take a drug-naive rat and you scan their brain and you see giant dopamine spikes. And then once they start to develop tolerance, they start to need more and more of it because they've been able to use as much as they want. Because scientists are great. We give rats lots of drugs, right? So what happens is that spike in dopamine activity starts to decrease over time. The greater the tolerance becomes, the less the dopamine system goes off as they're consuming the drugs. The dopamine system in the VTA and the nucleus accumbens, etc., these areas start to spike when they're anticipating using the drugs, when they're obsessing, when they're starting to, let's say, like the rat equivalent of talking to your drug dealer, right? When they know that the door is about to open and they're about to go get their drugs, or they see the water bottle is about to come back, etc. So the dopamine spikes when they're about to perceive that they're about to get their drugs, but it starts to taper off rather rapidly whenever they're actually consuming the drug of choice. So your classic addict is not struggling with dopamine when they're getting high. You don't really get high off of dopamine, so to speak. You're high for any particular drug, whether it's LSD or opioids or whatever it is, are more chemically dependent. The euphoria, if you want to call it that, is more chemically dependent upon the particular profile of a particular drug. So the euphoria associated with, opioids is more about your mu opiate receptor and your oxytocin receptors than it is about, your serotonin receptors and your dopamine system. Whereas if you, do some meth, it's a very dopamine and norepinephrine and serotonin heavy experience. So your high is very different from drug to drug to drug. So when you're pre-addiction in terms of pathology in the brain, it really is about that dopamine rush. So your average substance use disorder person, mild to moderate, is really about dopamine. But once we develop this progressive brain disease of addiction, it's really much more about that particular euphoria and the removal of that withdrawal negative affect experience. Because in terms of just chemicals in the brain, right, you see reliably that people with like a brain disease of addiction have this hijacked dopamine system and this hijacked opiate system and this hijacked cortisol system. So what's interesting is in active intoxication, so like in binge intoxication, what we see is a lot of dopamine spikes prior to the onset of binging. But once the binging happens, it's really all about your opiate system going off and your serotonin system and other parts of the brain that make you feel particularly good or safe in that way. So that's phase 2 or stage 2, binge and intoxication. But in stage 3, once the drug has left your system, so most drugs have a certain kind of half-life. I think nicotine's something like 50 minutes or something of that nature. So after about 50 minutes, you start to go through a characteristic withdrawal syndrome. And, for nicotine, it's something like irritability and kind of anxiety and maybe even some anger, muscle tension, stuff like that. So you will continue to self-administer nicotine as a means of getting rid of those withdrawal and negative affect experiences, essentially. So addiction's not really about getting high for the most part. What we end up finding out for people who we would call drug addicts, substance use disorder, or severe, is that it's really more about phase 3. And phase 1 and 2, anticipation and binge, are kind of the areas where you want to intervene if you can, especially anticipation. But typically once anticipation set in, you're already getting that dopamine firing going on, and you're already kind of interested in compulsive behavior at that point. Right. So the main focus becomes that, let's say, very excessive cortisol release in the extended amygdala during withdrawal or negative affect stage. That sense of irritability, that sense of low serotonin, that sense of high norepinephrine, which makes us feel bad, that sense of high kappa opioid receptor being set off, which makes us feel particularly irritable, believe it or not. So there's this complex chemical cascade in the withdrawal negative affect state. And depending upon the drug of abuse, you might have some extra, let's say, lack of glutamate if it's nicotine or alcohol, or this extra lack of GABA if it's alcohol, or this extra lack of dopamine if it's stimulants, etc. And so you have that lack of chemicals because you stop self-administering drugs. But then you have this presence of extra, maybe norepinephrine or cortisol or things of that nature that make you feel pretty irritable, especially extra kappa opioid activity in the withdrawal negative affect state in the extended amygdala. And I could talk to you all day about how, the ventral tegmental area and the binge intoxication area is heavily saturated with D2 and D1 receptors, as well as, oxytocin receptors, as well as mu-opiate receptors, and even some GABA receptors, interneurons, things like that. All that's pretty much irrelevant. What's relevant is there's these 3 phases, and these 3 phases are overlapping. So that anticipation preoccupation stage in someone we would call a drug addict is overlapping with the binge and intoxication stage, because as that prefrontal cortex starts to overly focus on the substance of choice and the behaviors that are needed, like planning very, very intentionally how to get high, scheming, being a good magician, so to speak. All these things are being done simultaneously while their dopamine system is getting ramped up and ready to go off and get triggered as they start to talk to their drug dealer or talk to, their bartender or get in the car to go somewhere, whatever it is. Those 2 things are going on at roughly the same time, and as you start to see a decrease in the substance in the system, you metabolize it, etc., your withdrawal and negative affect stage starts to kick in, and then lo and behold, simultaneously, you start to obsess again, right? If you ask any person who would call themselves an addict, if they spent too much time focusing on their withdrawal symptoms, they probably would say no. They probably started anticipating and obsessing pretty quickly as their withdrawal symptoms started to get pretty bad, or even just mild, right? So addiction's a very complex set of brain areas. In fact, if you were paying attention, it's a pretty substantial portion of your brain is involved in addiction. the perioccipital gray, the ventral striatum, the prefrontal cortex, the extended amygdala, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, the temporal parietal junction, your anterior cingulate, hippocampus. It's a disease of motivation, memory, learning, and compulsivity. And all the brain areas work like a symphony. They work together, and then often these phases overlap. And the different chemical systems overlap and are set off differentially depending upon the type of substance that is, let's say, ingested. But mind you, you always have to have dopamine, and you always have to have your mu opiate system go off whenever you feel safe and you feel relief now that you've gotten high. But then when that withdrawal negative affect state happens, it's, a pretty big spike in cortisol and kappa opioid receptors going off where you feel irritable and uncomfortable, and that makes your anticipation phase go off again. And there's a subjective lack of, different emotional states depending upon the type of substance you use. So it's a very complex thing. But I just want you to know that it's not just dopamine's reward. That's nonsense. And the people who still push that phrasing are pushing nonsense. Your dopamine system, your VTA, nucleus accumbens, is about learning rewards. It's about predicting rewards. It's about getting you excited to go get something. It's not about actually feeling high. So I hope that makes sense, and I look forward to any kind of comments and debate about that. So to recap, we have this preoccupation, binge, withdrawal set of circuits in the brain that are active both separately and in overlapping ways. And these circuits are hijacked by drugs of abuse in the sense that people cross a point, a tolerance and withdrawal point, to the point where they start to create memory, mood, motivation, the 3 M's, memory, mood, motivation. So addiction is a disease of memory, mood, and motivation. And these people that we call drug addicts have gone past the point of tolerance. They've started to what we call downregulate their dopamine system and their opiate system to the point where they create memory, mood, motivation maps in their brain, neural nets, which various systems become overly sensitive to signs of withdrawal or negative affect. And then this overly sensitive system becomes, let's say, paired, it learns with different stimuli. So the original stimulus, like the drugs, or learned stimuli like, maybe their drug dealer, maybe their romantic partner, maybe their, friend, maybe a place where they used to use, the people, places, and things if you're a 12-stepper. Right? So we create these memory, mood, motivation maps when tolerance and withdrawal start to set in. And then as a result, that preoccupation stage always is like working in the background, so to speak, except for when you're actively intoxicated. So you're constantly on the lookout and obsessing. Kind of the obsession is there, so to speak, for these different stimuli that will trigger you to use again and again and again. And then the compulsive behavior arises whenever you're appropriately triggered. So preoccupation, binge, withdrawal, somewhat overlapping, somewhat separate. And they're driven by different chemical systems. There's downregulation of the dopamine system during addiction, thanks to tolerance and withdrawal, and all these different kinds of complicated neuroscience concepts. But just know that when the Surgeon General calls it a brain disease, that's a fair statement. Now, does that mean that just because it's a brain disease, there's nothing we can do? No, absolutely not. Just like in diabetes, it's a disease of your pancreas and whatnot, there's something you can do there, right? So the goal is to make sure that you understand just how much of the brain is hijacked, just how many of these memory, mood, motivation maps are overly sensitive and overly present and overly valued in the brain compared to other stimuli, and that there really is a neurological problem there. And to think that there's not is silly, right? So keep in mind, this is just for the concept of addiction, not for substance misuse, not for people who are, college students who binge drink. That's not what I'm talking about. And again, most people who misuse varying intensity of substances don't have tolerance or complex memory, mood, motivation maps. Most people have some degree of fondness for a substance or two. Maybe they like pot or alcohol or nicotine or whatever. But just because they have a fondness and they have some behavioral and memory maps in their brain, that doesn't mean it comes with tolerance and withdrawal. For most people, except for probably nicotine, the average probably consumer of nicotine definitely has some tolerance and withdrawal issues. So it's important to keep in mind that I'm just talking about addiction. And this preoccupation binge withdrawal thing is only seriously problematic for this subset of people who misuse substances that we would call addicts, who have this progressive brain disease where they have basically taught themselves and hijacked their brain to be sensitive to different stimuli so that they have a memory map, a mood map, and a motivation map that kind of all work together at the same time in these different brain areas I talked about to help them obsess and look for stimuli differently than the average drug-naive person. So a drug addict, so to speak, who obsesses about using, who's sensitive to triggers about using, is different than the person who's not. If you have a bad relationship, that might just be a bad relationship. But for a person who has the progressive brain disease of addiction, especially if they were using with that particular partner, that partner is now part of a memory, mood, motivation map in which they use or get high or deal with withdrawal or whatever it is. So they have a very different relationship to their significant others than a person who does not have a substance use disorder. And what's fascinating is if we just scroll back up real quick, or I'm scrolling back up in my notes, if you go back up and you look at the different brain areas that are involved in the brain disease of addiction, the prefrontal cortex, the orbital frontal cortex, the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, the anterior cingulate, the periaqueductal gray, the hypothalamus, the hippocampus, all these areas, and the right orbital frontal cortex in particular, all these areas are kind of overlapping with your attachment systems, with your relationship systems, which is why if you were to ask most people who have what we call the progressive brain disease of addiction, how they feel about their substance of choice, they would describe it in terms much like a relationship. People say it's my first love. My first love was heroin, or my first love was alcohol, or whatever. That's a real thing, because essentially many of our relational brain areas are preferentially sensitive, or hijacked is the word I use, to these substances of abuse and the stimuli associated with them. So addiction literally is a relationship to intoxication. Because for instance, your periaqueductal gray, if you feel threatened relationally, that shuts off. And you feel unsafe, as if there's a tiger in the room. So your opiate system shuts off, your mu opiate receptors stop functioning, and there's a deficit of oxytocin and stuff like that, so you feel unsafe. Just like someone who doesn't have access to their drugs or their drug dealer feels unsafe in a very similar way to, I don't have access to my romantic partner. I miss you so badly, right? And people will go back to their drugs of choice no differently than someone who goes back to a terrible codependent relationship, right? So it really is a disease of disconnection, a relationship to intoxication. So that's the neuroscience of addiction in the simplest way I can go about it. And as you heard, I struggled with that because it's so complex. These brain areas are so complex. These neurochemicals are so complex. And it's literally impossible, I say, to simplify it any more than I already have. And I'm still doing the neuroscience literature a disservice because there's so much more to say. But for the purposes of keeping this video under an hour and a half, that's the gist of the neuroscience. We have a preoccupation stage, we have or obsession stage, we have a binge stage, and we have a withdrawal stage. And these stages happen in somewhat overlapping ways and are, essentially the addict has these mood, memory, motivation maps that regular people do not have. And they're preferentially sensitive to different stimuli, both drug-related and drug-adjacent, the using friend, the using girlfriend, the using drug dealer, etc. The places, the things. So that's the neuroscience of addiction. in the shortest possible span that I can teach it. So that we've done heritability, we've done neuroscience, now let's talk classic learning theory. So, for those of you who probably went to college and had your undergrad psych class, you probably learned about Pavlov and Skinner and all these people who are kind of the founders of learning theory, and Watson, who tortured little Albert. You learned about all these people, and you learned about positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, and punishment and things like that. I'm going to use these terms and try and explain addiction using these terms. So, for the substance-naive person, or for the drug-naive rat, drugs are positive reinforcers. They provide a subjective sense of this feels good or this is good for me, therefore I should do it again. That's what positive reinforcement is. So in classic learning theory, the unconditioned stimulus is the drugs. The conditioned stimulus is anything that activates the seeking system, our dopamine, VTA, nucleus accumbens, etc., that activates and manages a homeostatic need, food, sex, etc., etc. The conditioned response is to feel better or to feel safe, whatever it is. And the unconditioned response is to want drugs to feel better every time. So punishment in this paradigm would be when you're going through withdrawal symptoms or detoxing, right? And once tolerance starts to set in, you move from positive reinforcement, which is this makes me feel good, I want this, to negative reinforcement, where every time I use drugs, my cravings make me feel irritable. Because when your prefrontal cortex is going like crazy in the anticipation stage, your dopamine system's going off, D2, D1, but also you have kind of excessive glutamate and excessive other neurochemicals and norepinephrine that don't make you feel so good. In fact, you're kind of irritable when you want something and you can't have it. Like you're really hungry, you're hangry, right? So when you're going through, the tolerance development process, you move from positive reinforcement, I'll do this to feel good, to negative reinforcement. I'll use this to get rid of my cravings. I'll use this drug to get rid of my withdrawal or detox symptoms. So addiction, technically speaking, in terms of what we call learning theory, it starts out as substance misuse, where we just use too much because it feels good, because it's a positive reinforcer. And then the punishment starts to happen where we have withdrawal symptoms. But then as our tolerance starts to develop and our D2 receptors downregulate in our midbrain, etc., we need more and more of it to get the same positive reinforcement. But as the tolerance develops, the withdrawal gets worse. So we start to have more negative affect. We start to have more irritability around cravings. We start to have more anger, etc., when we want to get rid of our withdrawal symptoms. So addiction is technically a disease of negative reinforcement. Let's get rid of the irritability associated with cravings because I need more and more of the drug. Let's get rid of the irritability associated with detoxing, with withdrawal. So I hope that makes sense. So addiction goes from a positive reinforcement, this makes me feel good, but because of punishment and because of tolerance, both behaviorally, metabolically, and neurologically, it becomes a disease of negative reinforcement where the average person is not using to actually feel good. The average person, who we would call an addict, is using to get rid of their negative symptoms, their withdrawal symptoms, their irritability associated with not having their drugs. That dopamine system, that obsessing, seeking system, as Panksepp would call it, Jaak Panksepp, you take any animal and you let them get hungry, and then you put food in front of them, but they can't get a hold of it, they'll start to rage out, right? Anything that blocks our dopamine seeking system is going to make us rage out. It's going to make us feel irritable. So anytime you block someone who struggles with addiction from their drug, they're going to get irritable, which is why most people in treatment are not the nicest of people. They're probably kind of irritable. And that has nothing to do with being bad people or having bad parents. They're just experiencing withdrawal symptoms because their seeking system is being thwarted. And they're going to be irritable. So that's the learning theory take on addiction. And the more you learn about these things, hopefully the more you get to go, oh, I can have compassion for these people because a lot of their behavior, their craving, their obsession, the irritability, the nastiness, the manipulation, these are all part of a progressive brain disease that allows them to be unnecessarily sensitive to different stimuli. We go, oh, okay, I'm not an addict, therefore, I don't get why they're so irritable that they don't have alcohol or that they don't have heroin. Like, heroin's terrible for you. Why in the world would you be so pissed that you don't have access to your drug dealer or your using girlfriend anymore? Well, it's because that's associated with a sense of I'm safe when I have those things. No differently than, I just got rid of the tiger. I'm safe, essentially. It's like that evolutionarily primal to people who have the progressive brain disease of addiction. So the more you understand the neuroscience and the learning theory and the heritability, the more you start to go, wow, it's this messy, complex learning, genetics, brain problem where people who are basically reasonable people, I've worked with hundreds of people so far, I think, in my career, and I've worked with every kind of person. I've worked with lots of homeless people, I've worked with wealthy people, I've worked with intelligent people, not intelligent people, everyone across the spectrum of different socio-demographic categories, and they all have the same basic symptoms: tolerance, withdrawal, preoccupation or obsession, irritability when they don't have their substance, manipulative behavior, all this stuff that we would go, oh, wow, I can't believe that so-and-so is acting this way. But again, a lot of it is this brain disease that we don't quite understand, that even the best professionals in my field don't understand. I've talked with dozens of therapists about patients in the last, 10 years, and many of them have a bunch of myths, like the dopamine myth of reward. That's one that the vast majority of people who treat people with addiction disorders don't get. They think it's all about feeling good when it's not. It's predominantly about the negative reinforcement, about dealing with the negative affective state. They're not trying to get more feel good, they're trying to go back to normal. They're trying to get back to normal because of tolerance and withdrawal. They're trying to get back to this baseline state. They have this new homeostasis, right? So homeostasis is a medical concept related to the basic metabolic functions of your stomach and your immune system and stuff like that. And when a pathogen comes in, a virus or whatever, your homeostasis is all messed up, and now you have to send out a bunch of white blood cells and all this stuff to fix the problem, and you need to get back into rebalance. You need to rebalance back into your original homeostasis. Well, the problem with addiction is it creates a brand new homeostasis in your brain where you need more of this dopamine system being activated because you've started to kill off your dopamine receptors. And if you use a lot of meth, for instance, you start to produce less and less dopamine at the presynaptic because you've kind of blasted out your dopamine system with a dopamine-heavy drug like meth. So all these different neuroscience issues point to a very complex, very messy, non-euphoria associated problem. The euphoria is just the side effect, I guess you could say, of using. The real problem is the negative affect, the withdrawal, the negative reinforcement, if you will. So I hope that makes sense. We've done heritability, we've done neuroscience, we've done classic psychology learning theory, and now let's talk about the social factors that contribute some degree of the variance and why people develop addiction. So we know that certain groups of people are much, 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 much more, let's say, vulnerable to addiction disorders. So, for instance, we know that adolescents are much more vulnerable to developing the compulsive brain disease of addiction, as are the elderly, as are the wealthy, as are immigrants, as are the poor, the low SES, and those people in the criminal justice system. And not only are these people more vulnerable on average, but they're also more likely to be diagnosed with these substance use disorders. And for different reasons. One of the main problems with adolescence and addiction, which I'll talk more about in other videos, is most important areas of the brain are changing pretty substantially in adolescence. The period from 13 to 24, essentially, is what we mostly think of adolescence as nowadays. And in that time period, your dopamine system, for instance, areas related to your ventral tegmental area, your nucleus accumbens, your orbital frontal cortex, anterior cingulate, all these areas are learning how to play nice with each other. And different, receptors are growing or decreasing at different phases in different parts of adolescence. So as these natural biorhythms, if you want to call them that, these waves of changes in the brain, and the architecture and the density of receptors in the brain and neurons in the brain are occurring, if you throw some substances into the mix, now all of a sudden you're actually teaching the brain how to develop in adolescence. This is the number one reason why I would be very, very speculative and very, very concerned about most teens who use drugs consistently, is they're starting to actually change the structure and the function of their brain and how it's naturally developing. No differently than, teratogens in early development in utero. But the three kind of trimesters have different implications for drug use and how the brain changes. So if you're a parent or if you're a caregiver, a therapist, a family member who is involved with teens, please be very thoughtful and even open with them about your concerns, but no judging, no shaming, none of that crap, because that crap doesn't work. What works is education, and not the DARE bullshit. DARE doesn't work whatsoever with teens. We know that now. But what works is a reasonable, non-fear-mongering presentation of the consequences of continued use, especially if it's excessive, multiple times a week, using to cope kind of use in teens. And there's the ABCD study that's still going on that's worth looking up, where we're getting some pretty good data on what happens to kids' brains as they develop, and how addiction is probably going to be a part of, drug use is a part of kind of maladaptive developments in their brain. So just want to say that, different groups of people are sensitive for different reasons. So teens, because of their neuroplasticity issues and changes that are developmentally appropriate. And then the elderly, because of their isolation and their changes in their, let's say, agency and things like that. The wealthy, because they have just increased access, and other people because they have minority stress and things like that, things of that nature. Another variable that correlates, and this was part of my dissertation research, is, insecure attachment is pretty strongly correlated at, both in early childhood, adolescence, and adulthood. It's pretty strongly correlated with addiction. Now, there's always the chicken and the egg argument. Is it the insecure attachment caused the affect dysregulation, which made someone more vulnerable to use drugs? Or is it that, the drug use behavior caused giant rifts in their relationships, and therefore, they had to, develop some kind of insecure orientation towards closeness in relationships? It's hard to say. I haven't brushed up a lot recently, but my understanding is that people who struggle with insecure attachment prior to consuming drugs tend to more often develop substance use disorders. So, if you are a parent or if you're a teacher, just know that whatever you're doing to develop a positive relationship with your child is extremely important, because it's protective in a number of ways. The more secure the relationship, the more likely it is that they're going to flourish in the world. And same thing with insecure attachment, or the inverse for insecure attachment. And there are also some other common systemic variables that correlate very, very strongly with substance use disorders and addiction in particular. So, for instance, a lack of integration into society is a big variable that correlates with addiction for immigrant individuals. Lack of self-esteem, lack of security, for instance, poverty correlates very strongly with addiction. Or excessive disposable income, so for the very wealthy people. So all these different social and situational drivers are important to keep in mind, that increased access, increased stress, decreased connection often makes it difficult for people to not cope with substances of abuse. So let's take the prototypical example of someone that I used to treat, where this is a very good-looking kid, very nice kid. He got bullied a lot as a kid. He had He had like a kick-ass scholarship for sports in high school and was really good at a certain set of sports. And, he came from a well-educated family, Caucasian family. He came from, good genes, if you want to say that, if you want to make that kind of overly broad statement. Like, he didn't come from people who were having struggles with substance use behavior particularly, though I think his mom did with alcohol. But he came from a pretty good background in terms of your typical white educated, family in the United States. But because he was socially isolated and bullied and depressed and had all these other kind of predisposing factors, he had no connection because he felt isolated from his parents who were divorced. He had a lack of connection with his brother. He had a lack of connection with his peers because of bullying. And, even the sports weren't very positively reinforcing for him. So lo and behold, he started drinking and smoking a lot of pot. And eventually he started, having a lot of consequences and then tolerance and then needing more pot and then needing more alcohol and all this kind of stuff to the point where he needed treatment. That happens. It happens to wealthy kids. It happens to poor kids. It happens to every kind of person. But the more predisposing variables you have, the more, socially disconnected, isolated, struggling, insecure in your relationships, etc. you are, the more likely it is that you're going to struggle with substance use disorders. And then we also have Albert Bandura's social learning theory as a variable here. Just think about the positive reinforcing nature of peers who use substances. You know the phrase, birds of a feather flock together? Well, if you feel like a loner, or if you feel like a loser, or if you feel unsupported or unloved, or you have insecure attachment, are you going to hang out with people who have more secure attachment or insecure attachment? Well, probably insecure attachment. If you feel like a loser, are you going to hang out with people who are popular, or are you going to hang out with other people who probably also feel like losers? So we naturally attract people who feel just like us. And naturally speaking, the people who abuse substances or misuse them, especially in adolescence, probably hang out with each other. The whole, in terms of adults, it's 5 o'clock somewhere mentality is pretty common in corporate America and for many adults because, hey, my work day is over, let's go drown my misery in alcohol, right? So birds of a feather, it's a big deal. It's not the cause. You can't blame peers, just like you can't blame parents and you can't blame insecure attachment and you can't blame genetics. You can't blame any of these things. You can just say that these different variables have kind of differential influence depending upon the circumstances for that. So for that teen that I'm talking to you about, his peers, his parents, his depression, and the bullying all kind of play a pretty big role in the development of his addiction. Genetics a little bit less so because he doesn't come from a particularly strong family background of addiction. So that's just one scenario. Another variable in terms of social learning theory is just popular media, And this is not some weird white person rant against rap music because I love 80s rap and 90s rap, hip hop too. I'm not going to blame Snoop for our cannabis problem. Cannabis was a problem in the United States well before Snoop came onto the scene, etc. But just think about all the different songs of every genre, whether it's, country musicians and alcohol, or, rappers and pot, or lean, or any of that crap, or dabs, or, rock music and heroin, or reggae music and cannabis. It doesn't matter. Music, movies, television, the number of people who smoke in television shows, right? Smoke cigarettes. It's a thing. It's not the end of the world. It's not the main causal variable, but it's definitely a problem. It influences vulnerable people, right? It's not to say that It's the problem, but it's a problem. It's one of many problems, as you've heard me talk about in this video so far. Another issue in terms of like social learning theory are just our biases. We kind of learn and we observe role models who have biases that are awfully freaking stupid. You know, one of my favorite examples is of a bias-free conversation, or a relatively less bias-free, was the podcast that Joe Rogan did with Dr. Mike Hart and with, I think it's Alex Berenson is, I think, the author's name. And it was this wonderful 3-hour debate about cannabis and the problems with cannabis. And, you know, as biased as both Joe and Dr. Hart are, they both readily said that yes, adolescents by all means should not be smoking a lot of pot, if at all, because it does have some unfortunate impact on brain development. Substance use in teens is not a great choice, especially if it's consistent substance use. So, if even the biggest kind of, or some of the more famous, YouTube pot smokers are, right, cannabis, pro-cannabis people are, saying teens shouldn't be doing this consistently, or if at all, why in the world do we have all these other role models, whether it's television shows like Family Guys who say weed's not a big deal, or whatever it is? Why is it that people who love weed, who are just acquainted with the research, are saying let's be careful around teens, but popular media, movies, shows, songs, whatever, are not playing so, let's say, fair with the biases and the myths? And again, I'll admit that right now, my bias is let's be conservative about this because kids' brains matter. We only get one shot at adolescence and development, so let's try and do it the best that we possibly can. Now, that doesn't mean, being some kind of crazy abstinent person. Kids are probably going to naturally experiment, especially with cannabis nowadays. But there's a lot of myths around cannabis. There's a lot of myths and biases around heroin, around lean, around alcohol, around benzos, people getting barred out, so to speak. It's a big deal when you get barred out because you're like blacking out. You're whacking your GABA system and you're blacking out and you're losing memory, and that's a problem. You can eventually hurt your memory in very serious ways if you keep getting barred out as a kid, right? Same thing with weed. You can affect your brain in problematic ways. It's not the end of the world. You're not going to die and become some kind of serial killer or something like that if you smoke a lot of weed as a kid, but it's definitely not helping your cognitive development. It's not helping your frontal cortex wire appropriately downward into your limbic system, which is not really a thing, but your midbrain motivational areas and memory areas. It's not helping it wire appropriately. So you want to make sure that we deal with biases and myths. Just like there are myths about pot, right? It's like it's going to make you stupid. No, that's not true. If you smoke all day every day, yes, you're gonna be slow because weed's just naturally going to slow you down. But the average person who smokes a little pot here and there is not going to become some kind of mentally deficient individual. That's not true at all. But for teens, it's a problem. So that's the difference. So there are biases and myths on all sides. Saying that weed is safe is ridiculous. Saying that weed is more safe than heroin is obviously rational and logical. But it's all about the context, how much you use, how intensely you use, etc. And that's the nuanced conversation that people need to have. But we need to deal with the biases. The pro-pot and the anti-pot biases, the pro-alcohol and the anti-alcohol biases. Alcohol kills way more people than weed, but people have no problem putting it in movies, putting it in shows, putting it in songs, whatever, right? It's poison, but we drink it, right? So we have all sorts of biases and myths. If we account for them more, we do better. And another thing that's modeled poorly for a lot of young people in particular, in terms of preventative medicine, is people aren't modeled coping skills very well. People aren't modeled talking it out very well, So these are all the social variables that go into. So stigma, shame, bad role models, bad peers, birds of a feather, etc. Lack of self-esteem, a lack of integration into society if you're an immigrant, lack of security, excessive disposable income. All these things are variables that put you at a slightly greater risk of having an addiction disorder. So, I've gone through the biopsychosocial. I've gone through learning theory, social learning theory, attachment and security, neuroscience, heritability. We talked about as much as I possibly could to make this as simple and straightforward as possible in terms of, how addiction comes to be. And I hope it's perfectly clear that no one of these variables stands in isolation and is going to fix the problem. Like if Suboxone, for instance, buprenorphine, if that was going to fix the problem of the opioid epidemic, it would be done by now. But the research very clearly shows, and I believe Trump's Surgeon General just said this, if I'm not mistaken, that you have to have, or maybe it was like his head DA or whatever, but you have to be in a society where you have a job that's meaningful and purposeful, where you have friends and connection and community or church or whatever. You have to have all these things. You can't just get Suboxone and you'll be good. You need more than that. So if it was just the neuroscience and you just dealt with the brain and just gave them the right drugs, you gave them the right amount of Suboxone or Camprol or whatever, all of a sudden they wouldn't have a drug problem, right? No, that's not how it works at all, because it's a complex biopsychosocial problem. And when I talk more about the family issues in the kind of the third and fourth weeks, you'll probably see a little bit more why addiction is both a brain disease, but also a huge systemic illness. I've already talked about attachment. I've talked about parenting behavior. I've talked about peer group and all that stuff so far in a very simple way. But I want to dig into that a little bit more in the next episode of this series. So, to use kind of Jaak Panksepp's phrasing of his different primal affective systems, I would say that you could call addiction a disorder of seeking, safety, and connection, where the seeking parts of your brain, your ventral tegmental area, your nucleus accumbens, your orbital frontal cortex, which is responsible for valuing rewards and all that, are hijacked and preferentially sensitive as part of that mood, memory, motivation map that's created when you compulsively use drugs in the midst of tolerance and withdrawal. Your safety systems in the brain, your panic and grief system, as Panksepp would call it, are also hijacked in the sense that, we know that your periaqueductal gray, your PAG, is very, very important for feeling safe and for feeling not in a state of panic. And if you have too much of your kappa opioid system at play, you feel panicked and freaking out, and I have to use right now. But if your mu opiate receptors go off, you feel safe and you feel connected and you feel secure. And we know that, from the rat park study that Johan Hari talks about in his TED Talk, we know that, rats in particular who are more connected, people who are more connected, tend to stay sober longer. That's one of the best things about the AA world is, even though many people call it a cult, that's the great thing about a cult, is it allows you to feel connected. And the more connected you feel and the less shame you feel and the more seen, S-E-E-N, you feel, the less you want to use. Because we're highly social creatures. We're also highly simplistic creatures. So that's what I think addiction is. It's a pathological relationship to intoxication, as John Daly calls it. It's a disorder of seeking, safety, and connection, as I would call it, where our seeking system is preferentially sensitive and overly sensitive, and our safety system is undersensitive to the natural rewards, if you want to call them that, the people, places, and things that should make you feel good, like your parents, your friends, your boss, etc. So this is addiction. This is how addiction comes to be in a nutshell. And I've gone on now, I think, for a pretty long time. And I hope it makes sense. I hope the heritability piece makes sense. I hope the genetics piece makes sense. I hope the brain pieces make sense. I hope you see just how complicated this is. And whenever you hear someone like, what's that guy from Canada? What's his name? I'm going to look him up here. The guy from Canada who talks all about addiction, and trauma and stuff. He's really, really popular. I'm sure he's been on like Oprah and stuff. Let me see if I can get this right as I'm talking here. That's not Johann Hari. What's his name? Oh, there it is. Gabor Mate, right? So this Gabor Mate guy is apparently a very smart guy and all that, but he oversimplifies addiction way too much. If you take what I say here seriously, it should be abundantly clear that all these popular speakers like Johann Hari from his TED Talk and Gabor Mate and all of them are badly oversimplifying the process of developing an addiction. So what I hope you take away from this is that it's a very complex bio-psycho-social problem. If you don't believe that it's a social problem, look at the families afflicted by addiction. Look at the prison system and how it reinforces pathological behavior and keeps people in a using mindset. In fact, it's no problem getting drugs in prison, right? Because it's just it's a money problem, right? There's a huge economic incentive to keep addiction alive. Otherwise, the cartels would just quit, right? So, at alcohol companies and tobacco companies. So there's an economic factor, there's a social factor, there's a racism factor, there's a prejudice factor, there's a family factor, a parenting factor, attachment and security, genetics, brain susceptibility, friends. Everything matters. Learning theory matters. All of it matters. It's very complex. And if you walk away from my video here not thinking that, I failed. So I hope I didn't fail. I hope you see just how complex this is. And that's why you can't just have psychological treatment. That's why you can't just have medical treatment. That's why you can't just have social reinforcement treatment. You have to have all three into one. You have to have the family on board. You have to have the romantic partners on board. You have to have everyone on board. Otherwise, people fail. So, I hope this makes sense. I really am looking forward to continuing this series with you next week, or maybe in a couple of weeks now that my schedule is a little more free, when I talk about boundaries and triangles, family systems theory, and addiction. And if you found this at all helpful, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm also going to put a link to my PayPal. And I know, I'm a psychologist, so I probably have a fancy life or whatever, but any financial support would be great, especially now that I'm in a career transition. And I'm really trying to do this to help people. So I'm not actively looking for money, but it would be great if you could donate. So please do your best to support me somehow. And please, no matter what, please share. Even if you disagree or you think I'm off my rocker, please share, because I think that it's important to have as nuanced a discussion as possible about these topics, especially when it comes to mental illness like addiction. Addiction is a mental illness, so we need to deal with this. We need to deal with this seriously, and part of it is getting good information out, and I consider that this overview conceptualization is good information. So please support me if you can. I hope you're having a great Sunday. It's Sunday when I'm recording this. And have a good day, have a good week, and I'll talk to you again soon. Please comment, like, and share.